cameras are rolling.
Rolling. Sound speeding.
The time has come for our celebration of cinema's classic, Real Monsters!
Hello, everyone. I bid you welcome to episode 5 of Real Monsters Podcast. I'm your host, AJ Danna, and I'm grateful you're tuning in. Thanks for joining me today. Those of you who've been following along with the show may know that Real Monsters Podcast focuses not only on the history of your favorite classic movie monster characters, but also the many ways in which these undead characters are still very much alive and well. Thanks to talented teams of artists, writers, and creators all over the globe, the classic monster stories of yesteryear are being retold in unique ways, whether it be graphic novels, haunted attractions, films, and many other creative avenues, which I've been thrilled to feature on Real Monsters Podcast. On the last episode, I spoke with Brian Nyford, artist, writer, and creator of Monsters the Forsaken, a comic book series combining classic monsters and real-life history. Today's episode features Dacre Stoker and Dr. Chris McAuley, co-authors of Dracula The Return, Cult of the White Worm, a graphic novel now on Kickstarter that is also part of the larger Stokerverse of stories and experiences. Stick around to learn all about Bram Stoker's work, legacy, and future, thanks to the talented team behind the Stokerverse. But first, as you might know, I secretly invite each of my Real Monsters Podcast guests to begin their interview with a cheesy mad scientist laugh to keep that fun Halloween and horror vibe alive. But today, dear listeners, considering the connection our guests share with the Dracula story and legacy, we've prepared something a little different. So, without further ado, please welcome to Real Monsters Podcast, Dacre Stoker and Dr. Chris McAuley.
Blah, blah, blah. Welcome. Enter freely and leave some of the happiness that you bring. How's that?
That was excellent. Thank you, Dacre. And very good to have a special introduction from one of the descendants of Bram Stoker, of course, legendary creator of the Dracula character and the original novel that has spawned so many beloved adaptations. Thank you both for joining me today. Dacre and Chris, it is great to be talking to you on the eve of your Kickstarter reaching its final dramatic conclusion. You have a project that is brewing right now. We'll get to your introductions in just a moment, but first, Chris, please tell us what you've got brewing.
This is a graphic novel. It's called Dracula The Return, Cult of the White Worm. It's the first in a mini-series of what we're hoping to be a continuation of the classic Dracula novel by Bram Stoker. It's under the Stokerverse label that Dacre and I created. It's a 48-page book, and yeah, it's got a whole host of features. So we've got a 21-page full-color first chapter of The Cult of the White Worm that was written by Dacre and myself. Yeah, it's a authentic continuation of the original Dracula narrative. We've got all sorts of things going on in there with a reveal of the mysterious fourth bride that Bram had originally written. We've also, how Dracula comes back. So that's always an interesting one. And then we have a backup strip that was written by myself, Buffy the Vampire Slayer writer, Denise Cienson, and a whole lot of bonus text material that Dacre and I are currently writing, and surprise content that's yet to be revealed.
That is what I love to hear. There is a whole monster mash of content being packed into this book, which is now live on Kickstarter, and I'm really excited to dig into some of those details there, especially the fourth bride concept. For those listeners who don't know, as a creature performer, I did portray the brunette bride of Dracula at Universal Studios Hollywood in the Bride of Frankenstein Lives attraction, so those brides of Dracula are near and dear to my heart. Dacre, I would love to hear more about you and your background, your relation to Bram Stoker, and the Stokerverse project that you and Chris have created.
Well, thanks, AJ. It's really a pleasure to be here. Always a pleasure to chat with people who are really into the whole Dracula myth, the story associated to it. But let me give you a short background. Bram Stoker is my great-grand uncle. So his youngest brother, George, is my great-grandfather. Bram was one of 7 children. Only 3 of them had offspring. and obviously one was his youngest brother. Bram actually did have a son who ended up having a daughter. Daughter was married twice. Both husbands died in World War II, and there are a couple of great grandsons still alive, and they have leaned on me because I'm a little more creative in my soul, and I also connect with guys like Chris McAuley, who really help me be creative, and they've asked me to help, promote and Bram's legacy. And one of the ways that Chris and I are doing it is, as he said earlier at the top of the show, create something called the Stokerverse. So we have kind of brought some of Bram's other stories back to life with graphic novel adaptations of Bram's story, short stories as well that we're writing ourselves that go in different areas: games, video games, board games, RPG games. And of course, this particular Kickstarter is all about the continuation of Dracula. This is the 125th anniversary of the iconic novel. 1897 it was published. And what Chris and I have done is taken some of the really interesting things that I have found over the last 15 years of research that I've done that was in Bram's notes, that was in his journal that I discovered, actually, one of his great-grandson's attic, the actual typescript of Dracula, the one interview Bram ever gave that's been discovered. And we find all these little bits and pieces. As Chris mentioned, the fourth bride that was kind of buried in Dracula's guest that was exorcised from the original novel and only seen in the notes, and now it's been published or recently published by his wife. We're bringing that back alive as well. So lots of cool little, let's just call them, I wouldn't say golden nuggets, maybe black and red nuggets that we're keeping alive, and with a really great staff of artists and colorists that Shane Chebsby of Scratch Comics has found, and the story that Chris and I wrote. We're continuing the story of Dracula in a manner that we really believe honors Bram's legacy, and in a way, in certain things that he actually intended when he was writing Dracula, but either got edited out or didn't make it past the note stage because he just had so much material. And we're bringing that to the loyal Dracula fans by way of Kickstarter.
And that is an excellent feature, that your stories within the Stokerverse, what you and Chris have been working on, they feature an official edge, so to speak, because these are things that have been dug up, those nuggets from Bram's notes and journals. And anyone out there who has read Bram's original Dracula novel will know there is so much content that it's not surprising to hear there was some that simply had to be trimmed along the way. And in a world where we have had quite a few Dracula adaptations, having one that features these very exclusive elements that were specific to your family's history is something that I'm very excited to read more of. So, Dacre, when it comes to bringing Dracula back to life in 2022, I'm curious exactly who along the way or what sparked the idea to bring this character back in comic book form.
Well, I've got to take one teeny step back even further, because you've asked who decided to bring it back in comic book form. But the point is, when two creative souls like Chris and I, we spend a lot of time on Zoom, on the phone. The first question was, how did we decide to justify to bring him back? Because in the novel, and has been changed many, many times in different movies over the 100 years since movies have been depicting Dracula, the big debate is, how can you guys, even if you're a member of the family, justify bringing Dracula back? And Chris and I, to discuss this, they said, no, wait one second here. And this is kind of two guys just hashing this out. How is he supposedly killed in the novel? And it was like, well, was there a stake used, as Bram mentioned in the story when Van Helsing is explaining to the band of heroes how to kill Lucy? No, there was no stake. There was actually a Bowie knife. Did actually Harker cut the head off completely of the Count? No, it was just a slit with a kukri blade. Was there garlic put inside the body? No. So the dilemma that we capitalized on after lots of discussion and rereading and reading and seeing if there was something left out somewhere, we realized that there's a good possibility that Bram Stoker planned a continuation of this story himself, because the way he described it in his novel, there was really not a definitive ending. I took this one step further, and when J.D. Barker and I were writing Dracula, which was a prequel to Dracula, we traveled out to Seattle, Washington. Paul Allen, the co-founder of Microsoft, actually owns the typescript of Dracula. And in that typescript, we found that there was, right after the Bowie knife was thrust into Count Dracula's heart, and the throat was slit with a kukri blade, the Count crumbled into dust, as we all know. But in addition to that, just a few sentences later, Bram had originally planned a very definitive ending for his Count, a volcanic eruption, because the castle and the site of the final battle was actually on an extinct volcano, and I have been there myself with my son, but that's another story. So as Chris and I discussed, wait a sec, Bram had planned a very definitive ending right after the knife and the slitting of the throat and the Bowie knife. Why did he erase this? He actually crossed it out, and it was a really powerful passage. Very definitive ending with the castle coming down, the Count being destroyed, the gypsies having to take off, and the band of heroes running for cover. So that gave us the confidence that true Dracula fans will recognize when we give them this information, when we kind of let this be known to the world what Bram was planning himself, then we feel we've got the justification for turning this into a graphic novel. And Chris really is the guy behind the genius of turning it into a piece of work, an artistry, because we both recognize the fact Bram was an amateur artist himself. He was a man of the theater as well as his writing. So Chris, why don't you actually tell AJ and the listeners a little bit about your process on contacting Shane and actually lining up all these people to really turn this into something graphic.
Graphic novels are an amazing resource because they can be, at some level, better than a film, because you take snapshots in time and you can really pour over those snapshots in time and let the emotional impact of the artwork and the narrative wash over you. Dacre and I had always talked about doing more graphic novels. We had created our first graphic novel project with AUK, and it was the Virgin's Brace, which was an update of Bram Stoker's short story, The Squaw. But we had wanted to delve into Dracula a little bit. Dacre and I had worked with Shane last October. Shane had created a comic book horror anthology called Dead by Dawn. And Shane had reached out and said, "Hey, Chris, do you and Dacre want to write a Stokerverse story in this?" And of course we agreed. So I knew Shane was the right guy for the job. He's also a convention organizer, not just an editor and a comic book publisher. And he's got the contacts of some of the biggest and brightest talent in the UK and the States. So, yeah, Dacre and I had started constructing the script. I had been on the phone with Dacre. We talked about, bringing Dracula back. How would we do it? And how would we inject other aspects of Bram's work to make this a true vision of the Stokerverse? So we looked at the Lair of the White Worm, which I think was Bram's last novel, I believe.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, and there's some very striking imagery in there. And there's links to Irish mythology. There's links to cosmic horror. And when we injected the White Worm mythos in with Dracula, it really allowed us to open up Dracula in a way that was faithful and representative of the original novel, but it allowed us to go into a different avenue, different direction, which is perfect for comic books. So Shane read the script, loved it, and started assigning these incredible artists to the graphic novel. So we've got Ben Steinbach, hopefully I'm pronouncing that name correctly. He's from New Zealand. He's actually an artist on Hellboy. If you go to Kickstarter, you'll see his cover on there. We've got Shane Oakley. Shane has worked for Boom Studios on Cthulhu Tales, and he has done our main cover, which we've just released an image of today. It's very striking. And our main artist for the core story is a chap called Chris Geary, and Chris is well known to UK comic book fans, those who would follow 2000 AD style of work. And he's created this beautiful link to the written narrative just with his artwork. And Matt Soff has crafted the colours that really pop, that make the characters pop. So yeah, we've been very, very lucky in the creation of this. It's been a real amalgamation of stellar talent.
Well, everything that I've seen in the Kickstarter and everything that you've told me just now is really exciting to see such a talented team assembled to tell these stories, not only bringing Dracula back, but also integrating these other stories that Bram Stoker created that maybe many horror fans might not be as aware of, given that Dracula is sort of the magnum opus, so to speak. And Chris, it sounds like you have quite a bit of familiarity with the Bram Stoker body of work as well. How did you originally become familiar with Bram's work, or how did you become acquainted with Dacre? Tell me about how you first got involved in the world of Stoker.
I was at primary school, so I think I was about 6 years of age, and in our primary school library, there was a copy of Dracula. I'm not sure how appropriate that was for that age range, but I picked it up and started to read it, and I can't claim that I completely understood it all, but there was a resonance with the writing and the cadence, and my young mind just consumed it. Over the years, I started to read more of Bram's work, his dramatic pieces, his poetry. I went to the same university that Bram did, Trinity College in Dublin, and always had an affinity for Irish writers in general. I suppose I'm quite patriotic in that sense, but Ireland has produced some of the greatest writers and thinkers. It's known as the land of the saints and scholars for a reason. And it's not just all about St. Patrick. So, yeah, I mean, that was the start of my love for Bram's literature. I was asked to write this short comic strip for a horror anthology. And they said, pick a vampire, just write a vampire story. That was sort of what I was given. It was write a vampire story. So I thought about writing Dracula, but doing it in a different way. And it was basically Dracula in space. It was called Dracula, Lord of the Future. And I was teamed up with a 2000 AD artist to do that. And I wrote the script. I just was very aware of the legacy of Bram and the fact he was a fellow countryman as well. And he's also a Freemason. I'm a Freemason. So there's a very strong bond there. So I wouldn't do anything to sully his name or his memory. As I often do, I work late at night. I think I wrote the script, finished it about 3 o'clock in the morning, and really read through it and thought about it. And decided that I wanted to check with the Bram Stoker estate first of all, because if it was something that they didn't like, I could easily change the name of the vampire and we could do something different, So yeah, I think I sent the email out to the estate. Dacre came back to me and wanted to chat, and we started chatting. I think I had about an hour's sleep at this stage, but I was chatting with Dacre over a couple of cups of coffee, and it became apparent that we could do some interesting projects together, and that was the start of the Virgin's Embrace. So we wanted to craft this sort of treasury of Bram's short stories, because it's very much Dacre and I have a passion for sort of bringing all of Bram's work out. So not just focusing on Dracula. Of course, Dracula is interesting, but that's not the entirety of Bram's work, and that's what the Stokerverse project's really about. It's about bringing all of Bram's work into sort of popular public consciousness again, and then bring in the short stories in. We're hoping to do that and continue to do that in graphic novel format as well. So a real resurgence of Bram's work and the Stoker family legacy. So we talked about that, and then I think it all started coming together fairly quickly. It's all been a bit of a blur to me, to be honest. I think it came together quite quickly. I don't know what your recollection of that is, Dacre, but that's mine.
No, that's pretty close. It's always nice when somebody takes the time and has the interest to actually check with somebody associated with Bram Stoker Estate. My wife and I manage it for the two cousins, as I mentioned a little while ago. And, it's nice when people want to try to get something right. So much, even in biographies, AJ, people just use incredible amount of speculation and liberties about Bram. There's not much written about him, by him, very little source material. So you do have to speculate a fair amount, and not many people put as much work into it as Chris has done. But also I felt this, right off the bat, that being a fellow Irishman and a Freemason, there's a strong bond, and he did not want to in any way misrepresent either Bram himself or his work. And that was impressive. And we just sort of hit it off on that note. And as we say, the rest is history in the making. We've got all kinds of things that are in the works. we both are sort of plowing through and rereading and sometimes re-listening to audiobooks, audio stories of Bram's, and we get onto something. Oh, this is something. What do you think about this idea? For instance, Chris said, The Lair of the White Worm, the last story Bram wrote, it's not his best work. And sadly, not many people know it. They love to criticize the story, but he was actually really quite ill when he wrote it. And it was, I think, something that he wanted to write. I know from his son's notebook that he was asked by his publisher to write just, one more tale of the supernatural before he left, before he died. Bram had had a stroke at the time, so he was quite ill. He had lost the sight in one eye, and it was a little discombobulated, as people say, about the story. But it mentions real mythology that when I asked Chris about it, I said, Chris, what about this? He said, well, any Irishman would know this. And Bram really had some interesting ideas that he tied together. It was turned into an interesting Ken Russell film. Not the best, but if some people want to watch it rather than read it or listen to it, you get an idea. But what Chris decided was, we can take some of this, and I can't give spoilers away, otherwise I get in trouble, and I tend to ramble on this. But there was a really interesting origin story, let's just say, of vampirism connected to this worm creature that Chris said, hey, it makes sense based on his knowledge and understanding of Irish mythology. So he's been great to work with, and has the right sensitivities to be a guy to work with when we're dealing with somebody close to my heart, which is, my great-granduncle.
Well, you're right. It is very refreshing to hear a take on these stories that has that homespun, authentic research put into it between the mythology. And as a fellow Irishman, this is really a very unique interpretation of taking these texts and staying true to their heritage and their mythology, the lore that's already been established, and building that, spinning that into something new. And I will return to the Kickstarter book as soon as possible. But Dacre, I first wanted to ask you about these other works of Bram's that some other people might not know. Something that caught my eye, a story that has been adapted a couple times. As a classic monster movie fan, I was quite drawn to the concept of a female mummy, something we don't see very often, in Jewel of the Seven Stars. Would you mind giving a brief overview of that for our classic monster fans who may not know that Bram also tackled a mummy in addition to Dracula?
Yeah, there was a big fascination in the Victorian era with Egyptology. One of the things Bram's son wrote in his notebook that sits in the Trinity College Dublin library, where Chris attended as well, another connection with my co-author, was that, as he mentioned when he was giving some notes to Harry Ludlam, the very first biographer, that he said, my father did a tremendous amount of research and reading every time he wrote a book. And funnily enough, when I looked at the list of books that Bram's widow sold 2 years after Bram died, there was quite a few books that centered around Egyptology. And of course, I went and purchased a couple of these reprints of these books, and it went into the mystical magic and different horrifying things that occurred in what was known at the time, is interesting lore of vampires associated with Egypt. And so this is fairly classic Bram. He takes a topic that is readers are familiar with, and of course, all of your listeners of this show will realize that back in the Victorian era, these adventurers would go out and they would basically rob tombs, rob the pyramids, and bring stuff back and put it in British museums, put it in private collections. And, we always heard about the curses associated with these things. Bram, again, capitalized on that in the same way he capitalized on vampire fears that emanated from the Middle Ages and also from America with contagious diseases that people couldn't understand. So he jumped on this with Jewel of Seven Stars and brought it home. The other interesting little factoid is that Bram was quite close with the Wilde family. This is Oscar Wilde. William Wilde was a classmate of Bram's. Mrs. Lady Jane Wilde was a good friend of Bram. She functioned as a bit of a mentor to Bram. And Dr. William Wilde was a bit of a wild man. He got into trouble as a doctor with female patients. He was a naughty man, but he also was an Egyptologist himself. He traveled to Egypt, came back, wrote a huge sort of dissertation on Egyptology, which Bram had a copy in his possession, but he also brought back, a mummy. And so this, we don't know, if he was talking about that mummy, but all this, again, AJ, Bram bringing these stories close to home, these exotic travels to Egypt was fairly popular at the time, but only obviously people who had a lot of money could do it. So Bram brought it, the story to the British Isles, and it resonated there because people were so interested in it. And of course, he had to attach, this whole idea of immortality to it, which he struck a chord, in Dracula and in Dracula's Guest as well. So that's sort of a brief overview. It was actually a story that was adapted into a movie, one of the early Mummy movies. It's made its rounds in Hollywood as well, and it's one of those little known facts that Bram was into that as well. He's really quite a well-rounded writer.
Most definitely, and certainly a well-read writer as well. Having these books on Egyptology and all sorts of exotic and mystical subjects, that is always very interesting to hear how writers are absorbing this information from other sources and worldly events that are happening at that time and translating those into their stories. Now, Chris, as a fellow countryman, you obviously were familiar with Dracula from a young age, and as you learned more about Bram's work, you were finding more of a connection between him and yourself and your style of writing. So without giving any spoilers, if that's the way you'd like to go, I'm curious, along your way of discovering Bram's career, if there are any other stories that particularly stood out to you that you would like to adapt for the Stokerverse, or any of these other stories. Which ones resonated with you after you discovered Dracula?
Dacre and I actually wrote a prequel to Chill of Seven Stars that was published last year. We did that because we loved the sort of cosmic horror aspect of it, and the fact that it now links to our RPG universe. So we've put that in. So we did that, which was interesting. We were able to delve into that. I mean, I've been interested in, adapting Lair of the White Worm into maybe an audio drama. We've been looking at that. I think audio is a fantastic way to go for story, for narrative. We'd written Voices of Dracula together, which was an all-star audio cast, kind of zoomed in on aspects of the characters in Dracula and what they were thinking about during key moments. I have an interest in Bram's other works, so looking at The Primrose Path, which is a fantastic piece of drama, and it's something that most Irishmen who leave their country, I live in Canada now, so there was a lot of resonance with that, where the Irish family of the carpenter Joseph is saying, don't leave Ireland, don't go to England, don't go to those foreign places, because that's where the devil lurks. I had a lot of that. There's a general fear of the Irish leaving Ireland, which is strange whenever you think about how far the Irish actually travel historically, settling in America. This next pass is another one that I love. It's a bit of a romance, and it centres on the legend about St. Patrick defeating the King of Snakes. There's a little bit of a treasure hunt in there as well. So that's another one that I would like to adapt, probably in graphic novel format, I think, for that.
Can I jump in there, AJ? Because there's even though we talk about Bram's other works, there's one that's really top of our list that Chris and I have actually already adapted into an actual script. We're just waiting for the right time and have artists who are free to work on this story. But it's an incredibly powerful story that was a true story that has not been published, and it wasn't written by Bram. It was written by Bram's mother. Charlotte Stoker actually wrote a story that she had told to Bram earlier when he was a young boy, the first 7 years of his life. Not many people know this. He was very, very ill. He was practically an invalid. And he was then, as a result of his illness, kind of sequestered into his room by himself. And as he said later in one of these books he wrote about Henry Irving, that he developed a very dark sense of imagination because of this illness. We know that his mother and his nanny told him all sorts of stories as a way to keep him occupied and educated. And his mother told him a story about her own experiences as a young girl, 12 years of age, 1832, in the western part of Ireland called Sligo, where she experienced this horrible cholera epidemic that almost took out a third of the population of Sligo and forced her family to flee to find safe haven, and were turned back by militia of folks protecting their town. They didn't want any potentially infected people coming there. They had fixed bayonets. They took all their family's belongings and burned it, thinking that it was contagious, and sent them back on their way. So this is a 15-page story that Chris and I have adapted, and it is a story that Bram was told, and it involved, this is so creepy, AJ, it involved misdiagnosis of people and premature burial, and a body of one of their neighbors actually crawling out of the grave and still being alive.
Oh, wow.
It's so weird that it's true, though. As they say, sometimes the truth is more strange and more horrifying than fiction, and this is one of those. And Chris and I are really want to get this out, because even though all the other stuff Bram wrote is really creepy and really tells us a lot about Bram himself, because so much of it is autobiographical, this is a story that's autobiographical about his mother that had such an influence on him, and we're convinced an influence on him and his writing, not only Dracula, but some of the other ones Chris had mentioned, also The Judge's House as well. So there's a lot of us to work on in the Stokerverse, a lot of good stories. And one I'm just going to give one more plug to without going into much detail, but I think that one of probably his second best story is The Mystery of the Sea, written in Cruden Bay, Scotland. And it is there's elements so much like Dracula that is just phenomenal. So for your listeners out there, you want a good read or an audio book, go get The Mystery of the Sea. Dacre and Chris someday will either get it in some sort of audio drama, or may turn this into a graphic novel when the time is right.
What a fascinating story to know that what was happening behind the scenes in the real world was such a strong influence on Bram, and this story with his mother is just another piece of interesting history related to the Stoker family that most Dracula fans probably haven't heard. And knowing that you've had access to these stories and these notes and journals, I'm sure there's a lot more Stoker history that Dracula enthusiasts can learn from you, Dacre. And I see through Kickstarter that there are actually several more opportunities to learn about this history firsthand from you. Is that correct?
That is correct. One of the things I'm going to be doing is giving a 45 to 60-minute lecture on Zoom or some platform like that for people that jump in and pledge at a certain level. And I do these lectures all over the world called Stoker on Stoker: The Mysteries Behind the Research and the Writing of Dracula. I do them in person at many conventions. I'll be doing one in person at the International Comic Event, ICE, in Birmingham in September. But if you can't make that, then I'm going to be doing one, online as well. And I think we're talking about August the 15th in the evening in UK time. And Shane and I and Chris are talking about maybe doing one also that's better suited for North American time schedule as well. But I love talking about it. And as I said, I've been finding all these cool little nuggets and things about Bram's life and his research. And you're right, he does take things that happen in his life, happen around him, events that people are very used to, and twists and turn them and utilize them in his horror stories, and utilizing them in a way that horror writers call putting your readers into the position of a willful suspension of disbelief. You make them feel that what they're reading is actually real because of mentioning real things, real people, real places, real events that took place. And then lo and behold, the rest of the story that you weave into all these real events is actually fiction, but you begin to question it. And that's what people have done with many of these stories that Chris has mentioned, as well as obviously the Grandpappy of them all, Dracula. It's amazing how many people contact me and say, oh, your great-granduncle got this wrong. He mentioned this. I say, guys, do you know this was a work of fiction? What? Fiction. Yes, fiction. And Chris and I get to play with that as well. So thanks for picking up on that, AJ.
Absolutely. I am always interested in learning about more history, and I know plenty of other classic monster and Dracula enthusiasts who are interested in learning more as well. And I really hope that some of them will jump over to this Kickstarter, make a pledge, learn more directly from Dacre Stoker, and of course, read these texts that Dacre and Chris have prepared, because the stories that they're making in the Stokerverse, weaving these classic tales together and these unheard nuggets, are really something special. And as you mentioned, Dacre, there are many Dracula adaptations that have spun off since then, but very few that have actually included these details that you and Chris are combining from folklore and from the Stoker family. And that's a very special opportunity to get to speak to both of you today. And as I wrap things up, I would like to know, we'll start with Chris and we'll go to Dacre for this one. What do you think has made Dracula such a long-lasting story? That suspension of disbelief has spanned generations. Why do you think that is?
I think it's like almost like why does religion continue in its current form? It's that hope for immortality, the hope to live longer than your natural years. And that's always been the allure of the vampire and the allure, well, the modern vampire, I should say, and the allure of Dracula. You know, there's a promise there, but it's a terrible promise. It's horrific. I think that Hollywood has a lot to do with the longevity of Dracula as well. So not just Bram's wonderful prose, but I think Hollywood and the portrayal of Dracula as a very suave, sophisticated, handsome seducer, I think that has worked in the favour of the character.
I agree exactly what Chris has said. Everybody thinks about immortality at some time in their life, and there it makes sense that vampirism may be an option for some. But the other thing I think that provides great longevity and staying power of the Count Dracula that Bram Stoker created is if you really think about it for a moment, and you think the novel primarily, because this is where all these stage plays and operas and movies and on the big screen and on streaming all have come from, the Count Dracula character is not very well developed as far as what's his backstory, what are his motives, who is he actually? We really get to know him through the horrors in the minds of the characters that he interacts with. In the novel, for instance, all the band of heroes, that's you're reading their journals and their letters and their diaries. At the first half of the novel, they don't even know what is there, and they finally figure out what a vampire is because Van Helsing is able to do it. But they still don't know who Count Dracula is. He's a very, and I wouldn't even say, he's not even misunderstood. He's not understood at all because we don't really know who this guy is and where he comes from. So he's a sort of a wide open book when it comes to, well, let's develop him a little bit further. Let's give him a wife. Let's give him a son. Let's give him a child. Let's give him this kind of a creation. Different movies. Dracula Untold gave him a type of creation. Even the 92 Coppola film gave him a different creation than Bram used. And Bram was very, very, gentle when he suggested the Sholemans, which he got from the Scottish writer Emily Gerard, who understood about Transylvanian superstitions, that the school of the dark arts in the mountains over Lake Hermannstadt in Transylvania had the Sholemans, the school of the dark arts, where the devil taught his pupils these ways of manipulating nature and so on. This is where this Count Dracula learned his art. That's it. So gives a lot for writers and screenwriters and directors and people, artists to work with. And this is what Chris and I have done, and other people as well. But it just allows you almost this kind of open book, as I mentioned, or a palette to continue with what Bram started, and then adding your own little pieces to it here and there, your own take on who he was, what he was trying to do, coming to London, going over here, going there, what was his motives. So that's why I think he's got staying power, because he hasn't been developed to the point where we're tired of him. We keep learning more about him. And when you start learning something about him, somebody else learns to shapeshift him into something else, and then we got to start all over again. So I think, 125 years, we've got to know only so much about him. I think he's good for at least another 125 more.
And that is true immortality. that the character of Dracula has achieved to be lasting this long, and certainly 125 more and beyond, with many different interpretations, many different backstories, and elements added to this character and his whereabouts that are continually fascinating and continually fresh. And Chris, you discovered the original Dracula novel when you were 6 years old. Let's just say, hypothetically, through Kickstarter, Dracula The Return, Cult of the White Worm, is discovered by a 6-year-old today, or a young person who has an interest in horror and monsters, and they end up someday in a position not unlike the one you're in now. You discovered the Dracula story when you were younger, and now you are assisting in bringing Dracula to a new generation. Let's say they've picked up a comic or they watch a movie they really enjoy, and they have that spark to create a story, bring it to the page, bring it to the screen. What would your advice be to them? And I will also open this up to Dacre after as well.
Well, I would say reach out to your mentors, or reach out to your heroes and ask them to become your mentors. I did that. I ended up having great mentorship from Pat Mills, who created 2000 AD, Neil Gaiman, guys like that. They became my mentors. So that's important, I think. Have a goal. Actually have a creative goal. Sit down and write down what it is that you want to accomplish with the piece of writing, how you want the reader to feel as they read it, or, in the case of a game, if you're writing games, gameplay experience, the experience is very important. So yeah, I think overall you concentrate on the experience of the person who's going to be consuming your product. But just do it, I think, is the core of it. Like Nike says, just do it, go try it out, why not? What have you got to lose?
That's a great question, AJ. I'll simply add to what Chris said, this whole, the just do it idea. Keep plenty of notes. Don't be afraid to write things down on paper or record them somehow, but keep these notes as best you can. In a funny way, this is all we've got to go on when we look back at the genesis of Dracula 125 years ago. Is Bram's notes. Keep whatever you do on your laptop, on your computer, or in your notebook. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. Write as you should. Get inspired by Bram's Dracula, but in a selfish way, read some of his other books as well. I've written a prequel and a sequel to Dracula by doing all this research and finding a good co-author to work with me. If you're not a super strong writer like I was to start with, don't be afraid to ask co-writers to come in with you. And that's how I got to know Chris and Ian Holt and J.D. Barker. All these guys have helped me become a better writer, better contributor to these projects. Have fun with it, but as Chris says, just do it, and do it in a way that makes you proud at the end of the day.
Well, thank you for sharing that excellent advice. And also, you most certainly have picked a very talented team, Dacre and Chris. You have assembled artists and writers and creators to bring these stories to life in such a unique way. And having that creative team to continue telling these stories is one of the main reasons I started Real Monsters podcast, is not necessarily just to talk about history, but to talk about the people who are creating monster stories today and tomorrow, whether that be through graphic novels, audio dramas, haunted attractions, films. There are so many ways in which creative people are still telling these stories that I don't necessarily want to say have lost interest, because we know there are young people who still very much care about classic monsters. And anytime I'm up at Universal for work or otherwise, and I see a child interacting with Frankenstein in the park or Dracula, it reminds me that these stories and these characters, they really are immortal in that sense. So to be talking with the people like yourself, Chris, and yourself, Dacre, who are still bringing these stories to life, what can I say except thank you for the work that you are doing to continue telling these stories. So for those who are looking to consume these stories that you are putting forth through the Stokerverse, Chris, where can we learn more about Dracula, Cult of the White Worm, and any of the other Stokerverse projects you have coming up?
Yeah, for Cult of the White Worm, go to Kickstarter.com, and then you can search for Dracula The Return, Cult of the White Worm in the projects, and it should pop up for you. You can also go to our Facebook group, which is called Dracula The Return. For Stokerverse, you can just simply search Stokerverse on Facebook, or Stoker and McAuley on Facebook as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your time, Chris and Dacre. It has been a pleasure speaking with you and learning about your origins and the future of Bram Stoker's legacy. In my opinion, it's in very good hands with you two and the team that you have assembled. So bravo.
Thank you, AJ. Appreciate your time and your interest.
It was my pleasure, gentlemen. And with that, keep it real, monster fans. I'm AJ Danna, and I'll catch you next time on the next episode of Real Monsters Podcast. Real Monsters Podcast theme song by Alexander Taylor. Real Monsters logo and key art by Will Davenport. Real Monsters Podcast is an unofficial fan tribute to the classic monster stories of yesterday, today, and tomorrow, and is not sponsored by any of the entertainment entities discussed. Any and all opinions expressed within Real Monsters Podcast are those of my own or those of my guests. Stay tuned and subscribe to Real Monsters Podcast for even more monstrous discussions.